Everyone. That was a lovely introduction. And music and dancing, what could be better? I enjoy and love both, and they are hard acts to follow, for sure. It is my privilege to be here today, and I thank the John Dewey School for Children, as well as Partnerships for Sustainability Education, in the opportunity to participate in this really, really important discussion. I would like to share my screen, but unfortunately at this point it's disabled. Can it be opened up so that I can share that, my PowerPoint? Ah, excellent, thank you. Terrific. So I'm going to talk today about sustainability in a slightly different way. I'm going to talk about sustainable learning. And I'm going to start my presentation the way all of us have, because the crisis that we have experienced over the past year and that we are continuing to undergo, of course, is very much in the front of our minds. However, crisis can have its benefits. And does allow us to break through some intractable or cemented ideas or practices. And in fact, the crisis that we have experienced globally has also galvanized global conversations around some central issues. And I want to talk a little bit about four of them that have sort of preoccupied conversations around education for quite some time, and even more so during this time. Let me just spend a few moments on each, and in each discussion to kind of talk about some of the tensions and contradictions that are contained within each issue. The first, of course, is the whole notion of learning loss. And it is not news to any educator. All of us are very concerned about the impact of extended school closings on our students and on family, society, and teachers. McKinsey has done a survey looking at learning loss and has come to the conclusion, not a surprise, that learning loss is a global and significant phenomenon. And in fact, they put sort of a number on the amount of learning loss. They peg it at 5 to 12 months, with poor and minoritized children, as you can imagine, sitting, sort of higher up or further along that continuum of time. UNICEF has recently conducted a survey of 164 nations, and as they think about learning losses and reopening schools, and their study tells us that 70% of these countries are going to be focusing on recovering lost learning time. And how you recover time, well, some of the strategies are going to be longer school days, shorter summer breaks, and certainly a great deal of remediation built into the curriculum. And OECD, of course, we all know it as a key sort of international force, particularly around education, that is constantly focused on the relationship, between education and the economy. They, suggest that because of these learning losses, that economically GDP will be lower at 1.5% for the rest of the century. That's for the next 79 years. So we're talking about, pretty dire consequences, according to one perspective. However, there is some challenging of this idea of learning loss, and I would include myself in that group. So I'll start this conversation with a quote from Rachel Gabriel, who is a scholar in the US. And she says, "Learning is never lost, though it may not always be found on pre-written tests of pre-specified knowledge or pre-existing measures of pre-coronavirus notions of achievement." So what she is suggesting is that how we measure learning depends on the instruments that we use to measure it and the definition that we have of learning itself. In fact, there is a recent research, it actually just came out last month in April, that's indicating that students are actually starting to rebound from academic setbacks at rates and levels that are surprising to educators. The next issue, of course, that is animating discussions around the world is around machine learning, technology, digitalization of education, and artificial intelligence. And, you know, talk about sort of making cement move. The pandemic caused us to break through that cement ceiling of moving from face-to-face to online and virtual teaching in a huge hurry. And many folks who would never have imagined, many teachers would never have imagined that they would be teaching online pretty much all the time, suddenly found themselves doing it. But the question is, how well did we do this? I think there's unfortunately too much evidence that we sort of just transported what we do in face-to-face environments to an on-learning or virtual environment. And so there ended up being a little too much talking and telling and pouring of content into students, as opposed to thinking differently about online pedagogies. We all know as teachers that the heart of good learning and teaching is never the tools. And therefore the heart of good digital learning, of course, is not about the technological. And yet we continue, I think, to focus too much on the tools rather than the tool makers or the folks who are implementing the tools. A third issue is teachers. And of course, teachers, they've always been at the top of the discussion around educational change and the future. But during the pandemic, teachers were definitely put in a very, very different light. And all of a sudden, millions of people around the world, parents, families, policymakers, anyone who had children, anyone who was engaged with schools, suddenly realized how difficult the job of a teacher is. And so teachers were held up as sort of paragons of, you know, sort of community goodness. At the same time, teachers were also demonized. When teachers were concerned about going back to school, they were concerned for their own safety and for the safety of their students. There was a lot of criticism of teachers. And there was also a lot of pressure on teachers to be able to sort of produce and deliver in the same ways, even though we have been obviously in a very, very different reality. In the middle of this discussion is a lot of conversation about what teachers need to know as a consequence of the experience that we've gone through, but also as we look towards the future. And there are, you know, some tensions and disagreements about what the focus of continuing professional development for teachers should be. And I've listed just a few of these, and they are not sort of uniquely discrete, but at the same time, where we place our resources, our energy, our focus, and our time will make a great deal of difference for students. So should we pay more attention to, you know, academic learning, given the fact that we are so concerned about learning loss? But we also know that social distancing has created lots of issues for young people who have been separated from their friends, from the school community, and from sort of social interactions with others, so that social emotional learning, wellness, and mental health have become paramount. Regardless of where you sit on the, you know, these sides of the fence, the reality also is teachers all over the world are being asked to do more and more with now less and less because of the sort of financial impact of the pandemic. So that, I think, is a very serious consideration for all of us. And finally, an issue that is, you know, resonating around the world is this notion of the future. What will the new normal be? How can we sort of manage the uncertainty? Where are we going as a world and a society? There are so many ways, as you know, Principal Barrazo so eloquently said earlier, that we have shot ourselves in the foot and have created, an unsustainable future if we don't change our behaviors very quickly. And yet it is sort of ironic that in the middle of talking about the uncertain future, we are also trying to control it and trying to predict it. So for instance, when I think about McKinsey again, so McKinsey predicts that the current cohort, because of all the learning loss, will lose out on $60,000 to $80,000 worth of lifetime earning. And the World Bank says that $10 trillion will be lost due to lower learning and to dropouts. And my question is, lower learning about what? What kinds of jobs will folks be working that they will, sort of have this income gap that McKinsey is talking about? It is sort of problematic that we insist on predicting a future that we keep saying is unknown. And on top of all this, layered over it, under it, and throughout it, is the issue of inequity, oppression, and justice, or injustice. That we know millions of children and people around the world do not get the support, basic needs met, education, respect that they deserve, that they live on the margins and they live under oppression. The pandemic has brought those issues into relief in a way that all of us are completely aware of the inequitable divides that are in our society. But there is a question of whether or not we will move beyond the rhetoric of, oh my goodness, isn't that terrible, to making change, because these issues of injustice have been in place for a very, very long time. So the thing that we have to be worried about is the status quo. It has, as Michael Fullan says, a gravitational pull that works against change. And the last song that we heard about change really resonates with this comment. We are in a moment of great possibilities. So much has happened, and there is indeed great momentum for change. But there is also a powerful yearning for life before COVID, and a lack of acknowledgement that we may simply never get back to where we were. So today, I want to talk about sustainable learning to move us away from sustainable teaching. If you think about the 4 issues that I just, sort of outlined, all of them are focused on sort of sustaining what is already in place. And that has not served everyone well. Thinking about learning loss according to, traditional and current metrics and definitions of achievement, thinking about, teacher PD in the context of technology and online, thinking about the future in terms of money that's going to be lost as a result of kids being out of school, simply will keep us where we are. But sustainable learning shifts our attention from teaching to kids, from the teacher to the student. We have been working hard to sustain teaching that we have in place, but I want to talk a little bit about what it would look like to sustain learning and to shift our focus. Of course, in that conversation, I'm going to focus on the themes of this session: the what of learning, the where of learning, and the how of learning. And to do that, I'm going to ask my friend, Rebecca Stanton, who is a teacher in New York City, to help me tell this story. So this is Rebecca's story. Let me tell you a little bit about Rebecca. She is a master teacher, and I do not use that term lightly. She is a brilliant, brilliant educator. She has been working for 25 years and counting with immigrant youth and their communities.
Yep.
She is a teacher of English language arts, as well as a teacher of English as a second or new language. And she has recently taken herself back to school to get a credential as a reading specialist, because she began to see sort of the intersection of newcomers joining her classroom, their language learning needs, but also needs around particular reading barriers. And because there's no reading specialist in her school, she said, well, I guess I need to be it. She works at a school that we all call CHA, and CHA stands for Community Health Academy of the Heights in New York City. It is a school in certainly not an advantaged community at all, and is considered high need because it works with students, receive students who, evidence, multiple vulnerabilities, and one of which is poverty. Rebecca works always with newcomers, and in fact, she works with the newcomers who join her school. And you can see just from the slide in 2017 who her students constituted. They come from different countries. They bring with them all kinds of experiences, some of which are traumatic, all of which are challenging, and they come with different levels of schooling, experience, language, etc. What is very noteworthy about Rebecca and her students is that they consistently achieve above the norm, and this is on those traditional assessments that I talked about earlier. In New York State, students they don't have to, they can choose to pass what's called the Regents, which is a high school leaving examination. And it's challenging to achieve a Regents pass. And her students consistently perform above the norm, even compared to those who speak English as a home language. But the achievement is not simply on tests. I think that is very, very important to underscore that her students achieve in terms of their engagement with the world and their activism, in terms of the authentic writing that they do, in terms of the deep dialogues that they have with one another and with teachers, the inquiries that they initiate, and the performances, not in sort of concert kind of performance sense, but the public performances they give in terms of sharing their work with others in the community. So looking at Rebecca's work, I thought about the what, the how, and the where, to say, how does sustainable learning look if we change the what? In Rebecca's case, the what always begins with students. It always begins, and this is language from Rebecca herself, what is important to them, what interests them, what gives them a purpose for learning, because this is what engages students. When students have purpose, they are more willing to spend time and the work honing their understanding, improving their drafts, and working on their fluency. The part about, or the common practice around what students should learn, too often in sustainable teaching comes from the outside. We tell students what they should learn. In Rebecca's case, sustainable learning starts from the inside of students, what they internally care about. But just identifying, sort of a meaningful what is not enough. The how is equally important. And for sustainable learning, the how depends, in Rebecca's case, on sort of two different ways of looking at learning. So one is a way of looking at students themselves. And Rebecca always perceives her students as thinkers who have powerful ideas. She says that they are thinking about the world, and they have lots of important things that they have to say. She also sees them as invested learners, and in fact, tells a story about students wanting to come to her class after school to spend time working on drafts that they were getting ready to present to members in the community outside their school. But the how is also the way in which learning is organized and structured. And even though Rebecca, as a teacher, obviously has a structure in mind, and she says, I have to keep the standards um, in front of me as we, my students and I, co-create curriculum together. So she says she looks to her students to help her develop the curriculum that they're going to engage with in class. She says they are invited to be part of the curriculum development, invited into the design of the classroom. And she believes that strongly because in order to be invested learners and to be thinkers with powerful ideas who have voice, you have to be a member of a strong community. And this is one comment on the strong community that students themselves develop. Our learning community is interconnected. When we support and encourage each other, we all learn better and grow as learners. And finally is the issue of where. Where does sustainable learning happen? And for Rebecca's students, it happens out in the world. You cannot work on things that matter to you and not be engaged with space and time and people outside your classroom. So here is a picture of their participation in the People's Climate March in Washington, D.C. in 2017. And it's, it's a very appropriate example for today's conference because the students themselves had questions and concerns. And so they raised issues of climate change, they raised the issue of immigration, they raised issues of equity, of food security and insecurity. Those are the things that they wanted to study. And this field trip is not simply, a sort of ad hoc trip that one does over a weekend, but is embedded within a full and holistic examination of climate change that is, a sort of concerted effort between Rebecca and her students. Here are students presenting their teen advocacy projects at Teachers College, Columbia University, with which Rebecca partners and has been a partner for many, many years. And so students have, sort of authentic, legitimate, and informed audiences to talk to about their work. And so when you have a real purpose for sharing what you do, and you know that folks are going to take seriously your work, there is a great deal of reason to be motivated about doing it. And finally, and there are many, many examples, these are only three, every summer students participate in a citizen scientist project. This is an intensive program that brings together a couple of universities and NGO, students from high schools, of course, experienced teachers from several New York City public schools, as well as pre-service students and new teachers. And in fact, our friend in the hat is a new teacher. I think he might have been in his second year of teaching at the time. But what these students do is work with scientists and a local river project collecting data on the health of rivers. And going back to this notion of doing authentic and meaningful work, the data that they collect actually is used by the River Keepers project, and students have presented, to city council members what they've learned about improving water quality and about sustainability. So if I were to characterize Rebecca as a teacher who I feel engages in this notion of sustainable learning, what are some ways in which or characteristics that she brings to this? I think the first is that she brings an equitable mindset, which means that she sees her students as if they're on the brink of greatness. And this is without question. She sees them as the glass that is half full, that is full of capacity and potential. But it comes with a sort of, warm demands for students to do their best and to do better. And she provides those supports, but her expectations are that they can always do because of their capability. The second is the use of empowering pedagogies. And in Rebecca's case, I will name, sort of four things that I think have meaning for sustainable learning. What matters is the curriculum, not as it's quite often defined, i.e. in content terms, but as it's defined in a holistic experience that actually has relevance and meaning for the students who are participating in it versus receiving it. We quite often think about curriculum delivery as if it's, fast food where you just kind of plunk something down and kids gobble it up. Curriculum is developed, created, evolves through participation, and that is what matters in sustainable learning. You can learn skills through anything. So why not learn skills through what matters to you, what matters to students, what is important in their lives. I've talked a little bit about authentic purposes and audiences. So much better to write a project that someone who cares about what you have to say is going to listen to, rather than writing a research project that or a paper that gets a grade and gets stuck in a portfolio. And finally, the whole notion of the community of learners, and that community actually extends beyond Rebecca's classroom. If you were to walk into her classroom today, she would immediately invite you to be part of that learning community and to support her students in whatever way and with whatever talent that you have. The last is that sustainable learning comes from love, and Rebecca loves her students, but not in sort of a modeling sense, but in the sense of great and deep care, deep respect, with deep understanding that the future of the world depends on them. But I will borrow from my friend BC Fenimore, who many years ago wrote a handout where she listed 10 ways to treat all kids like rich kids, because unfortunately, kids who are poor quite often are not treated as nicely as kids who are not. And I'll just share the first, which is, BC says, make sure that you speak to, connect with every student in your classroom every single day. Make sure that they know that they're noticed and they matter, and that you see them. Because there are many kids going through school year after year, day after day, hardly being noticed, hardly having interaction with important others. So just a couple of things to finish my talk, and that is, when we think about sustainable learning, we have to, I think, consider what are central animating forces in our work. Equity has to be very much at the center. And we have not, as a sort of world education community, focused on equity. We have focused on compensation. We have focused on filling gaps. We have focused on trying to level the playing field through resource distribution. And those are the good examples. But in many cases, we have actually neglected children and ensured and perpetuated actually inequitable practices. The second is that we need to reclaim not what counts. We're doing too much counting in education, but what matters. And again, what matters has to be connected to what our young people care about. We have to think about preparedness for whose world. It is, as I said, ironic that we keep talking about being prepared for a future that is uncertain. What we need to be talking about is helping young people think about the future that they want and how they can get there. The future that would be, welcoming, sustainable, and happy, wonderful for everyone. And finally, we have to be very cautious about evidence. So much evidence is used for the wrong reasons or by folks who are not directly associated with students. So we need to ask lots of questions about this evidence, who's created it, and what purpose it's being used for. When I think about sustainable teaching, I think part of the reason why we have been stuck in this place is that we've been focused on teaching something, teaching about something, our focus on content, content, content. So our teaching what and teaching how have been actually very, very narrow. This is a dead idea, and it's a dead idea whose time has long been done. What we need to be focused on is teaching someone, teaching a person, teaching learning that has meaning for a human being, teaching for something as opposed to teaching about something. So in closing, when I think about how in our search for what's missing in order to get to sustainable learning, we have to think about what, but we also have to think about who. Who comes before what? We have to think about why, not just how. The purpose of schooling. And the purpose of schooling was never, should never be about getting high test scores, high ranks, good QS numbers, PISA scores, or, a paycheck. And in terms of where learning should happen, well, absolutely, it should happen everywhere. It does happen everywhere. It's just that we miss the opportunity to connect that everywhere learning with the learning that we think only happens in the classroom. So thank you so much to everyone. Appreciate your kind attention, and of course, appreciate the opportunity to be here in today's discussion.
Thank you for such valuable insights, Professor Lin Goodwin. We were able to learn about a lot about what is sustainable learning, some benefits of the crisis. We must reclaim not what counts, but what matters. We shouldn't just teach about something, we must teach about what and how. At this point, Professor Goodwin will be giving us a few minutes of her time to take in some reactions or questions from our audience. Kindly feel free to send in your questions in the chat box.
So I see a couple of questions that I can answer. So one question is about Hong Kong and the dominant mode of teaching still. Hong Kong has been in a period of educational reform for 20 years. And I think in general, the movement has been from teacher-centered to learner-focused. It has been from sort of discrete subject knowledge to looking at learners more holistically and thinking about whole person development. However, the distance between goal or intention and result or action is always a challenge. And so I would say that in Hong Kong, probably if I were to make a gross generalization, that we still have a tendency to focus far too much on sort of content knowledge and the delivering of content. And a lot of, much of learning is driven by the DSE exams. They are the end of school, high school leaving examinations, because those test scores sort of dictate whether or not you'll get into university, what area in university or field of study you can enter, and which university, what quality university you might have access to. So as long as we continue to shape achievement in certain ways, it is very, very hard to change teaching because goals are fixed in some sense. So Rebecca's example shows us that you can focus on those kinds of external measurements, but at the same time engage in sustainable learning that places students at the center. But it is not easy. And she is certainly someone who has been doing it for a very long time. So I think one thing we need to learn as educators is how to do both things. As I said, earlier, you can learn skills in all kinds of ways. So why not learn skills embedded authentically in important questions that matter to our world? So, has COVID made the situation for teaching and learning better or worse? Hmm. I think COVID has presented many challenges to us, and there's actually quite a bit of evidence coming out that learning has been, going back to the conversation about learning loss, that there have actually been a lot of gains by students, gains that are not measured by tests, gains around time management, resilience, independence, the kinds of things that young people were doing to support and help, their families. So it, to say it make it better or worse, there were some parts that were very, very challenging. But I think overall, I'm not sure that COVID has I will say this, COVID has the possibility of making teaching and learning much, much better because it has been, sort of that force that has broken the cement. The question is, will we just pave it over and move on? Because as things start to kind of revert to ways that are more recognizable, as we go back to schools, are we going to place kids again in those classrooms at those desks, listening to teachers? Are we going to revert sort of to our old behaviors? And it's connected to another question around, schools and focusing on high grades and their social reputation, as opposed to, collaborative, sustainable education and well-being of their students. It is connected to social values. It's connected to power, and who is making decisions about schools and for schools. It's associated with families and communities. There's a lot of press in Hong Kong, for instance, where families want to see worksheets and lots of homework. They want to hear, that what's being taught is about subject, because their own experiences of learning tell them that is what learning is. So then, going back to the whole notion that was discussed this morning about a world community and global collaboration, I saw a figure recently that there are 72 million teachers in the world. What if 72 million teachers were, what if half of those, what if 1/4 of that number work together in order to push back against, what is commonly thought of as important in schools, to, revise, that thinking, to demonstrate through evidence that teachers have all the time of sustainable learning that is meaningful, where stories like Rebecca's can be told over and over again, not just in sort of discrete conversations like this one, but at an international level, because we all know there are millions of teachers who know how to do this. We need to be learning from them. Okay, sorry. Current political climates. Yeah, that is an interesting conversation. So let me go back to this question of how do you think we can get to know what is important to the learner? Students, teachers, stakeholders, society, research. Well, Pretty much you start by asking. We don't do enough asking of students. We do too much telling. We have a curriculum that is fixed. We have ideas about what needs to be learned first and what needs to be learned next. It is hard for us to think about both and, so that we're doing things simultaneously. It is, if you think about some kids who are labeled, sort of slow progress learners, they are constantly relegated to a boring diet of basic skills, because the assumption is that you need those skills as building blocks to do more exciting things. I'm not suggesting for a second that skills are not important or basic skills are not important. Of course they are. But I'll go back to what I said before. You can learn basic skills in a drill and kill kind of way, or you can learn basic skills as part of curriculum learning projects that are connected to what is important to you. Um, I don't have the opportunity to talk to young people enough. I certainly don't have the opportunities I had as when I was a teacher. But there's never been a time when kids didn't have lots of ideas about what they wanted to know and questions about things. But the part of the problem is that we don't listen or don't provide that space for asking. Sir Ken Robinson, who's done a lot of work on sort of creativity, and unfortunately passed away just last year, if I have it correct, prematurely. Amazing work, around learner-centered education, around engaging schools and around creativity. And he said very, very clearly that in schools, we kill creativity. If you think about young people coming to school, young people come ready to learn. Young children are curious. Folks talk about young children not being able to, focus. All of you have seen 4 and 5-year-olds really hunker down into something and spend tons of time on a project that they want to do. I have young people outside my apartment building who practice skateboarding endlessly every single day. They fall, they don't do it right, but they spend hours on that practice because they care about it. Young people, students will spend the time on stuff that they care about. So our job as teachers is to to find out what they care about. Oof. Why isn't that great? Okay. How can the usual subjects in schools, including engage, what is important to the students? Well, I'll go back to, Rebecca as an example. So Rebecca asked her students, what do you want to learn about? What matters to you? What are your ideas about the world? And they come out with issues like climate change, immigration law, the Dreamers Act. I mean, all those, and this of course is in the US. Those are simply topics. Then Rebecca uses those for students to learn about what they're supposed to learn about. So one of the important skills on standardized tests is argumentation. Well, isn't it kind of almost a natural to think about developing your argumentation skills around controversial issues such as climate change, where there are lots of different opinions, lots of different practices, lots of different issues. It is when I think we provide and open spaces for complex education and complex curriculum that we create platforms that lend themselves to the typical subjects. If you talk about climate change, you can look at history, you can look at mathematics, you can look at science, you can look certainly at all kinds of social issues. You are reading, you are writing, you are debating, you are doing artwork. I mean, all of those things can be contained within those important topics. But we are accustomed to doing things separately and discreetly, not having connections to a bigger picture. That is where we need to be better as teachers. And it is not a mystery. It's actually, it's not that it's easy, but it's certainly not that hard. So I think that is when we think about continuing professional development, teachers learning how to do that and learning together to do that is where the answer lies. When the pandemic is over, would you still recommend the conduct of online learning instead of face-to-face teaching? Again, I would say that, it shouldn't be an either or. If we're focused on learning, then we're focused on the kind of teaching that serves the learning we want. And it may be that for certain kinds of learning, online is best. And for other kinds of learning, face-to-face is best. And for other kinds of learning, independent, self-regulated learning is best. But to say, well, pandemic's over, let's just all go back to class, that is the worry, that we will go back to just the way things were. Because, and focus on the delivery, the teaching, as opposed to focusing on learning and the learner. So I would hope that we don't simply go back to what was, that we will use this experience, which has shaken us all, to continue to feel that sort of internal dynamic movement towards something that's different and better. I don't know how much time I have, so there are other questions that I haven't answered, so maybe someone can, because I want to be respectful of the time that I've been given.
Thank you so much, Professor Goodwin. Thank you also everyone who sent in their questions. Maybe we can take at least last two questions before we move forward to our next keynote speaker. Thank you very much.
Right. Great, thank you. So there's a question about work being hard for me since this pandemic has started. And I would say that work has been hard for everyone, partly because what we have learned is even in the transportation of face-to-face to online, um, it doesn't just happen magically. It's not the best thing to do, but it is actually not simple. What we have learned that, staring at a screen for many hours at a time is, even if it's, you stare at a screen for an hour, it feels like more time than, looking at a teacher for an hour in a face-to-face classroom. We have learned that the way in which we spend our time with others is far more valuable than we ever knew. And we've learned that the pandemic has created a whole new set of issues and problems, as any change would. So I think, we must congratulate ourselves because we have picked up, we have changed, we have moved, we have experimented, we have fallen down, we've done lots of things. So we have done absolutely the very best that we can. But what we need to do then is to not kind of have a big sigh of relief when everything is over, and who knows when that will be. But as I said, to take the opportunity of this moment. Yeah, I'll add, to that response, the sort of flipped classroom approach. And I will say that I think the flipped classroom approach is very useful and helpful, but I do not believe that we have fully developed or utilized it to the extent that we could. And so quite often, or too often perhaps, the flipped classroom becomes an opportunity to basically lecture online, asynchronously, and then to lecture again when students come to you on screen. So when So in finishing, I guess, this this conversation, let me just choose one last question. Okay. There's a question about political climate in countries affecting education, and it says, how could? And my answer would be, how does it not? Political climate affects everything. And certainly, education ends up being either the whipping post. Things are wrong because you educators didn't teach properly, didn't teach the right things. Or they end up being the savior. Everything will be okay if we do the right kind of teaching or learning. So again, going back to that world community of educators, we need to work in solidarity because we are neither devils nor saints. We are part of the ecosystem of education. And too much of that ecosystem is disturbed by forces outside schools and classrooms where teaching and learning actually occur. And we are quite often too busy sort of following, responding to the mandates. Let's try and be actors in this as well. Activist educators for the benefit of our students. The education is used as a political pawn to gain votes, to sell property, to do all kinds of things. We need to resist that. So education is always political. The question is, what political aims should it serve? And I would suggest that perhaps the ones it is serving now are not the ones that we would put first on the list. So thank you again, everyone, for your kind attention, your really great questions. I could talk on and on, but as I said, I do know that there's a full program and other speakers. It has been really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I do wish you a wonderful 2 days. The start of it has already been so sort of not just enlightening, but also heartening in the heartfelt sense.
Thank you so much, Professor Goodwin, for answering the questions that some of our participants sent in. We truly appreciate it. Thank you also to the participants for your enthusiasm and active participation. Before we move on to our next keynote speaker, we would appreciate it if you turn on your cameras so we can take some photos to document this special event. Everyone smile. We'll take several shots.
Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, smile. Another one. 1, 2, 3, smile. One more time. 1, 2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Another one. 1, 2, 3. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Goodwin. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.